The first thing you need to understand is that Corporal Darren Voss wasn't supposed to be there. Not on that ship, not in that corridor, not standing between 5 Cathari blades and the most important living being in the known galaxy. He was supposed to be on leave. 48 hours of shore leave on Callisto Station, eating real food for the first time in 4 months, and sleeping in a bunk that didn't vibrate every 6 seconds from engine feedback. That was the plan. His commanding officer had signed the paperwork. His duffel bag was already packed. He had a restaurant picked out, some hole-in-the-wall Pakistani place that a buddy had told him about, said the Nahari was close enough to real that it'd make you cry. He never made it to that restaurant. What he made it to instead was a med bay aboard the GCS Arhenvor, unconscious for 11 days, with so many regenerative patches on his torso that the nurses said he looked like a patchwork quilt. And when he woke up, when he finally opened his eyes, there were 2 queens sitting beside his bed. Not 1, 2. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how it started, because if you don't understand where Darren Voss came from, who he was before that corridor, then the rest of this doesn't make any sense. Let me back up about 6 years. Darren grew up in Karachi, not the nice parts. The parts where the power goes out 3 times a day and the streets flood every monsoon season, and you learn early that the world doesn't owe you anything, not comfort, not safety, not a clear road ahead. His mother worked double shifts at a textile factory. His father had left before Darren was old enough to remember his face. He had a younger sister named Saba, and from the time he was about 9 years old, he understood that his job in this universe was to make sure nothing bad happened to her. That's where it started, that protective instinct, that thing inside him that couldn't stand back when someone needed help. He joined the UEF, United Earth Forces, when he was 19, not for the money, though the money helped. Not for the adventure, though he was young enough that it sounded good. He joined because the recruiter had told him that the UEF was humanity's wall, the thing between the rest of the species out there and the 8 billion people living on Earth who had no idea what was actually moving through the dark between stars. He liked that, being the wall. He was good at it too. By the time he was 26, he'd done 3 tours, 2 in the Verath contested zone, 1 in the outer reaches of the Serpentes Arm, where a cluster of unaffiliated warlord species had been raiding colonial supply lines. He had a commendation he never wore on his uniform, and a scar along his left jaw from a piece of shrapnel that had taught him to keep his head lower than he thought necessary. His commanding officer, Captain Yvette Marchetti, had written in his last evaluation, Voss demonstrates a reflexive protective instinct that sometimes overrides tactical caution. In most soldiers, this would be a liability. In Voss, somehow, it keeps working out. She'd meant it as a backhanded compliment. He'd taken it as the straightest compliment he'd ever received. The mission started as an escort job. Simple, clean, low risk. That's what they told him when they pulled him off his leave rotation at 300 on a Tuesday and handed him a classified briefing packet that he had exactly 40 minutes to read before he had to be in full kit and standing in Hangar Bay 7. The Arhenvor, a galactic cooperative systems vessel, one of those enormous joint species diplomatic ships that looked like someone had welded 4 different alien architectures together and hoped for the best, was making a diplomatic transit through the Ventaris corridor, a narrow band of space that technically sat in the neutral buffer zone between 3 different interstellar governments, but that everyone with any tactical sense knew was Cathari territory in everything but official designation. Aboard the Arhenvor, ambassador delegations from 7 species, a 12-person UEF liaison team, and 1 passenger who outranked all of them put together. Her name, in its closest human phonetic approximation, was Salindra Vas Vorath, Queen Mother of the Vorath Collective. The Vorath were one of the oldest civilizations in the known galaxy, Not the most militarily powerful, not the most technologically advanced, but old in a way that commanded something close to reverence from every spacefaring species that had made first contact with them. They were humanoid in a loose sense, 2 arms, 2 legs, bilateral symmetry, but their skin had this quality to it, like bioluminescent silk, and their eyes were a deep amber that seemed to hold more light than was actually hitting them. They stood about 7 feet tall on average and moved like they had all the time in the universe, because in a very real cultural sense, they believed they did. The Queen Mother was making this transit to attend a summit at Veldris Station, where a coalition of species was trying to hammer out a new framework agreement on resource rights in the outer spiral. Her presence there wasn't just diplomatic, it was symbolic. The Vorith had been neutral arbiter figures in galactic politics for 3 centuries. If she walked into that summit, it meant the agreement was worth taking seriously. Which meant that certain parties had very strong reasons to not want her to arrive. The UEF knew this going in. That's why they'd attached a 12-person security team. That's why the Arhan Vor was traveling with 2 escort frigates. That's why every crew member had been background checked 3 times, and the ship had been scanned for contraband so thoroughly that a lieutenant had joked they'd accidentally found 3 undeclared sandwiches in cargo. They thought they'd covered everything. They hadn't covered the inside. Darren met the Queen Mother on the 2nd day of the transit. Not officially. He wasn't high-ranking enough for an official introduction, but he was posted at the intersection of Corridor 7 and the main diplomatic promenade, a wide, high-ceilinged walkway that ran the length of the ship's middle section, all translucent panels looking out at the stars, the kind of view that took your breath away if you let it. And she walked past him. Just like that. The Queen Mother of the Vorith Collective, with 2 of her own personal guards flanking her and a cooperative protocol officer half jogging to keep up, and she walked past him like she was taking a stroll. She stopped. Just for a second, right in front of him. She looked at him with those amber eyes, and he looked back. He kept his face professional, his eyes forward, the way you do when you're on post, and she said something in Vorith that the translation implant in his ear processed as, "You have the face of someone who carries other people's weight." Then she walked on. He stood there for about 3 seconds processing that. Then he went back to watching the corridor. He mentioned it to his bunkmate, Corporal Fenris Hale, a lanky Swede who'd been in the UEF longer than anyone and who had strong opinions about everything. Fenris had laughed and said, "Mate, they say she reads people like we read text. Old species thing. They've been watching us long enough they can tell more about a person from their face than we can tell from a full dossier." Darren thought about that for a while. Then he let it go, because that was another skill he developed, the ability to let things go when they didn't have immediate tactical relevance. Except it stayed with him, the way she'd said it, not like a compliment, like an observation, like she was noting down a fact. The attack happened on day 4. Darren would later learn, much later, from the classified incident report that he technically wasn't cleared to read, but that Captain Marchetti showed him anyway, that the Cathari operatives had been placed aboard the ship during the reprovisioning stop at Murith Station 3 weeks earlier. They'd been deep cover for the entire time, crewed as maintenance technicians. 2 of them had actually been doing legitimate maintenance work for 3 weeks, because Cathari intelligence was thorough like that. They didn't just insert sleeper agents. They inserted sleeper agents who actually did the job they were pretending to do so that the cover would be airtight under any level of scrutiny. There were 5 of them, all Rai. Which, if you don't know the species, and before this mission Darren only knew the basics, they're a mid-sized species, gray-skinned, about 6 feet on average, with 4 arms and a cultural tradition around bladed combat that went back so many centuries it was essentially religious. The Cathari were one of those species that made first contact with humanity and immediately decided humans were soft, too fragile, too emotional, too dependent on technology to compensate for physical limitations. The thing about the Cathari, though, the thing that a lot of species forget because the 4 arms and the cultural warrior thing is distracting, is that they're also extremely patient. They don't attack when it's flashy. They attack when it's optimal. 4 in the morning, ship cycle. Skeleton crew on watch. The Queen Mother's personal guards had been replaced 3 hours earlier by the night rotation, 2 Vorith guards who were, by species biology, naturally less alert during the dark cycle. The diplomatic promenade was empty. The escort frigates were running their own maintenance cycle. For a window of approximately 40 minutes, the target was as soft as she was ever going to be. They came through the maintenance access hatches, all 5 at once on a coordinated signal. Blades drawn, long, curved Cathari combat blades that the translation matrix listed as Shenvrak, which meant something like the end of argument. They hit the night rotation guards fast and quiet, and Darren would find out later that both Vorith guards survived, but it was close. Then they went for the Queen Mother's quarters. What they didn't account for was Darren Voss, who was not supposed to be in that corridor. Here's the part that never made it into any official report, because it was too small and too human to fit the language of military documentation. Darren couldn't sleep. That was it. That was the whole reason. He couldn't sleep, which was a problem that had been with him since his second tour, when they'd spent 11 days in a siege situation where sleeping meant dying, and something in his nervous system had decided to just stop trusting quiet. So at 3:47 ship cycle, he'd gotten up, pulled on his uniform, and gone for a walk. Not patrol, not duty. Just a walk the way he did when his brain wouldn't shut off. He was walking the promenade, looking at the stars through the translucent panels, thinking about his sister Saba's upcoming wedding, and whether he was going to be able to get leave approved, when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not an alarm, not a human voice, something quieter, the specific quality of movement in a corridor that's been mapped and practiced and executed with precision, the sound of people moving who don't want to be heard moving. He'd heard that sound exactly twice before in his life, both times in combat zones. His body recognized it before his brain fully processed it. He was already moving when the first Cathari came around the corner. He didn't have time to key his comms. That's the part people find hard to believe, but it's true. The attack was fast enough and close enough that stopping to call for backup would have cost him the 3 seconds that were the difference between reaching the Queen Mother's door and not reaching it. So he didn't call for backup. He ran. And the 5 Cathari, who had been moving with perfect coordination and hadn't expected a lone human soldier to be standing in the middle of their corridor at 3:47 looking at stars, had to adjust. And adjusting cost them 2 seconds. Darren hit the door of the Queen Mother's quarters at a dead run, slapping the emergency lockdown panel as he went through, which bought another few seconds before the first Cathari blade came through the frame behind him. The Queen Mother was awake. She was standing in the center of the room, wearing some kind of long robe that moved like water, and her amber eyes were wide and this is the detail Darren would always come back to when he tried to describe it, not afraid. Not afraid in the way a person is afraid when they're about to die. It was something else. Like she'd considered this possibility and had made her peace with it before he even walked in. She said something in Vorith that his implant translated as, "You again." And he said, and he would be slightly embarrassed about this later, "Ma'am, I need you to get behind something solid." There was a large ornamental structure in the room, a Vorith cultural artifact the size of a wardrobe, made of something dense and dark, part sculpture, part spiritual object. She moved behind it without being told twice. He took up position between that artifact and the door. The door didn't hold long. Cathari field blades can cut through most standard UEF door materials given enough motivation. By the time the first one came through the doorframe, Darren had his sidearm up and put 2 shots center mass. Cathari biology is different enough that it slowed the operative down but didn't drop them immediately, which was a problem. Then it was 4. He got another one in the shoulder with a shot that went wide. His hands weren't totally steady, and he'd be honest about that later. He wasn't running on adrenaline and training and exactly enough terror to keep him very, very focused. And then the third one was inside the room, and the distance was too close for the sidearm to be useful, and he went hand to hand. Here's what Darren Voss knew about Cathari combat. The 4 arms were the obvious thing, but the real problem was the speed. They were fast. Not superhuman fast, not science fiction fast, just the specific, trained, practiced fast of a species whose entire culture had been doing this for a very long time. And they fought with a coordination that came from the 4-limb framework. While 2 arms were doing one thing, the other 2 were already setting up the next thing. And your brain, evolved to track 2-armed opponents, was always half a second behind. He took the first blade in the left forearm. A gash, not a stab. The Cathari had been going for something vital, and he'd moved enough to change the angle. It hurt in a way that registered as information rather than pain, because the adrenaline was doing its job. He took the second blade in the side. This one was worse. He felt it go in and felt it come out, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a calm, clinical voice said that's going to be a problem in about 4 minutes when the shock wears off. And then he hit the Cathari operative with his elbow hard enough to crack something and got the blade out of that hand and put it into the third operative's leg. Third blade came from behind. He'd lost track of the 4th one in the melee and paid for it. A cut across his back that opened up a line from his shoulder blade to about midway down and immediately made every movement feel like fire. He was still between the door and the Queen Mother. He was also, at this point, running on fumes and adrenaline and what his sergeant from basic training had once called the specific kind of stupid that humans do when they've decided someone else isn't going to die today. 4th blade caught him in the right thigh. The 5th, the one that hit him under the ribs on the right side, angled up slightly. That's the one the doctors would say later had missed his liver by approximately the width of a coin. He didn't go down. That's the part the Cathari didn't expect. The part that, according to the incident report, which included testimony from the one Cathari operative who survived in a state capable of answering questions, broke their tactical rhythm. A human with those wounds was supposed to go down. Darren Voss didn't go down. He went forward. The corridor alarm had been triggered by the door breach. The cavalry was coming 3 minutes out, which is very fast by any reasonable standard and felt like 3 years. Backup arrived to find the room secure. 4 Cathari operatives down in various states. One in the corridor with a dislocated shoulder and 2 cracked ribs who had apparently decided the mission was over. And Darren Voss on one knee in the center of the room, one hand on the floor, his uniform destroyed, bleeding from 5 separate wounds, his sidearm still somehow in his right hand. And the Queen Mother of the Vorith Collective standing beside him, with one hand resting on his shoulder. Not behind the artifact, beside him. When they asked her later, the captain, the ship's diplomatic officer, everyone wanted to know why she'd moved from cover, she said. He was kneeling. I could not allow him to kneel alone. He was in surgery for 6 hours. The doctors were UEF certified, but the medical technology on the Arhan Vor was cooperative, which meant it was several generations ahead of anything available on a human ship. And they told Captain Marchetti afterward that on a standard human vessel, with standard human medical equipment, Voss's probability of survival with those 5 wounds would have been somewhere around 30%. On the Arhan Vor, with cooperative medbay technology, it was different. He was in critical condition for 4 days, then stable, then improving. He was unconscious for 11 days total. On day 12, he opened his eyes. The ceiling was white. Not sterile white, not hospital white, a soft, slightly warm white with organic curves to it, the Vorith aesthetic in the design of the med bay that had been assigned to him, because the Queen Mother had personally requested that he be moved to the Vorith medical wing of the ship, where the technology was even better than the general cooperative facilities. He blinked a few times. The light was gentle. Someone had thought about that. Someone had made sure the light wasn't harsh. He turned his head to the left. Fenris Hale was sitting there, reading something on a data pad, and he looked up when Darren moved and his face went through about 6 emotions in 2 seconds. "Oh, thank God," Fenris said, in the specific flat, controlled voice of someone who had been holding it together for 11 days and was now releasing the pressure valve very slowly. "You absolute idiot." "Hey," Darren said. His voice came out as a croak. "Don't talk yet, I'm going to call the medic, just don't talk." Fenris put the data pad down and leaned forward. "Do you know where you are?" "Ship," Darren said. "Yes, are you in pain?" He did an inventory. Not much pain. Surprising. Whatever the Vorith medical technology had done, it had done it thoroughly. "Not really," he said. "That's the regenerative patches. They've been rebuilding you from the inside, which you'd know if you'd been conscious, but—" Fenris stopped, took a breath. "I'm glad you're awake." "How long?" 11 days. Darren let that settle. 11 days, the wedding. Did Saba. "She knows you're alive. Marchetti sent a message the first day. She said to tell you she's furious with you, and she loves you and her husband-to-be cried when he heard you were going to make it." Darren closed his eyes for a second. "Good." "Listen," Fenris said, and there was something in his voice, something careful, the way you say listen when you're about to tell someone something that's going to require adjustment. When you feel up to it, I mean. Not right now just breathe, but when you feel up to it, there are people who want to see you. The captain. Yes, and look, I'm just going to say this. The Queen Mother hasn't left the ship. Darren opened his eyes again. The summit was delayed 3 days waiting for her. They ended up doing a virtual link for the first sessions because she refused to leave before you were stable. And then when you were stable, Fenris paused. She's been here, fairly consistently, sitting here, reading those, he gestured at the side of the bed, where Darren now noticed there was a small stack of what appeared to be physical Vorith books, handbound, arranged with a precision that suggested they'd been placed there intentionally. Her personal staff is very politely losing their minds. Darren looked at the books, then at Fenris. "There's also," Fenris said, "a second person. And this is the part where honestly, I'm going to need you to just let me tell you the whole thing before you react." He told him. It took a while. Darren mostly just listened, which he was good at. The short version was this. The Cathari assassination attempt had not gone unnoticed in the larger political community. The summit had been thrown into crisis, not because the Queen Mother was harmed, but because of how close it had been, and because of what had happened in the aftermath. The Queen Mother's account of what she had witnessed had been transmitted to the Vorith collective. In Vorith culture, the act Darren had performed, a single individual, unarmed and unprepared, standing between an attacking force and a protected person, and refusing to fall, had a specific name. A cultural weight to it. Fenris struggled to translate it properly. The closest he could get was something like the unmovable threshold, a concept that in Vorith tradition was associated with the rarest kind of honor, not the honor of strength, but the honor of choosing to remain. The Vorith Collective had sent a formal response to the UEF and to the Galactic Cooperative. It was, by all accounts, an unprecedented document. In 300 years of Vorith diplomatic history, they had never formally recognized an individual from another species for this kind of act. The language was ancient and layered, and the translation teams had been working on it for days, but the core of it was clear enough. Corporal Darren Voss of the United Earth Forces was, by Vorith recognition, something they called Shenvrath, a word that roughly meant keeper of the threshold. And the second person, Fenris said very carefully, is the daughter, the Queen Mother's daughter. Her name is Velindra Saul. She is, apparently, and I cannot stress enough that I am just telling you what I was told, the heir to the Vorith Collective. And she arrived on a Vorith diplomatic courier ship 8 days ago and has also been, according to the staff who are handling this with incredible diplomacy, spending a significant amount of time in this ward. Darren was quiet for a moment. How old is she, was what he said. Vorith aging is different, Fenris said. She's equivalent to late 20s, early 30s in terms of where she is in the Vorith life cycle. She's an adult, very much an adult, with a position in the collective's governance structure that makes her. He stopped. She brought you a book too, I think. There were, Darren now noticed, 2 separate small stacks of books by the bedside. The medics came. There was an examination. There were questions, tests, gentle checks of motor function and cognitive response. His Vorith physician, a tall, quiet woman with the bioluminescent skin and the amber eyes and a calm professionalism that Darren immediately respected, told him that his recovery was proceeding extraordinarily well for the extent of the injuries, that he would need another 3 to 4 weeks of rest and light rehabilitation, and that he was. And she said this with a kind of scientific precision that made it somehow both clinical and staggering. The first human whose cellular repair rate we have had the opportunity to observe under Vorith medical protocols. She said it like he was interesting, not like a specimen, like a person who was genuinely interesting. He liked that. Captain Marchetti came that afternoon. She sat down, looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You know I can't put in you for a commendation for this, right? You were off duty. Technically you were supposed to be on leave. This will all go in the record, but the way it gets recorded is." "I don't need a commendation," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said, "I don't suppose you do." She put a hand briefly on his arm, the most personal gesture she'd probably made to anyone in her command in years, and then she was back to business. "There's going to be a debriefing when you're well enough. Full incident review. The Cathari situation is a diplomatic nightmare, and it's going above my pay grade very quickly. You're going to have to tell the story several times to several people who are going to ask you the same questions differently." "Understood." "And there are some," she paused. Captain Yvette Marchetti, who had navigated the Vareth contested zone without blinking, chose her words here. "There are some requests from the Vorith side for access, to see you, when you're ready. I've been managing the schedule, but I can't." Another pause. "I need to ask you directly what you want to do about that." "The Queen Mother," he said. "Yes." "And her daughter." Marchetti's expression was completely professional. "Yes." He thought about it. He looked at the ceiling, the soft, warm white of it. He thought about a corridor at 347, and a sound that didn't belong, and a woman with amber eyes who had not been afraid. "I'll see them," he said, "when I'm ready." "Good," she stood. "Rest, eat, that's an order." She was already moving toward the door. "Captain," she stopped, looked back. "The summit, did it go through?" Something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly, but the space where a smile lived. "The framework agreement was signed yesterday. All 12 member species, unanimous." She looked at him steadily. "She came back for it. When you were stable, she went." She said. Marchetti looked like she was deciding whether to pass this on, then decided. "She said the threshold had been kept, so she could." "She left." Darren looked at the ceiling for a while after that. Part 2, the Queen Mother's words. "She came on the 3rd day, after he woke up. He'd been warned. The staff, the Vorith attendants who rotated through the medical wing with quiet efficiency, had let him know that morning that the Queen Mother had requested to visit that afternoon if he was willing and if his physician cleared it. His physician cleared it. He said he was willing. He'd expected protocol. He'd expected formal, the way everything involving someone of her status was formal. The correct way to address her, the correct posture, the correct eye contact or lack thereof, all the diplomatic geometry that governed interactions at that level. What he got was a woman who walked through the door, dismissed her attendants with a gesture, and sat down in the chair beside his bed like it was the most natural thing in the world. She was wearing something simpler than the robe from the night of the attack. Still Vorith in its construction, the fabrics they used had that liquid quality. The way the material moved like it was slightly reluctant to hold a fixed shape. Her bioluminescent skin was different in this light than it had been the night he'd first seen her, when the corridor lighting had been functional and then emergency red. Here, in the soft, warm light of the medical wing, there was a quality to it that was almost like dawn. He couldn't stop noticing it, and he was fairly certain noticing. It was impolite, but he couldn't help it. Her amber eyes found his. "You are awake," she said, in common galactic, not Vorith, which meant she'd made a deliberate choice to speak a language he could understand without the translation implant. Her command of it was impeccable, a slight rhythm to it, a cadence that was clearly Vorith in structure but that carried itself beautifully in the shared tongue. "Yes," he said. Then, because some instinct told him that this person did not require anything formal from him, had earned something more honest, he said, "I'm glad to be." She looked at him for a moment. "I am also glad," she said. "Though I will not pretend, I did not spend 11 days with significant doubt about that outcome." The doctor said. The doctors were optimistic. The numbers were not for the first 4 days. She folded her hands in her lap. They were elegant hands, four-fingered, with a faint luminescence along the backs. "I have spent a great deal of time in this room over the past 11 days. "I heard that," he paused. "I'm sorry for the delay it caused, the summit." The summit happened. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite calm. "The agreement was reached. It is signed. These things would have happened without me." A pause. "Or with my absence. The meaning of my presence at the summit is not the logistics, it is the symbol. And the symbol has survived." She looked at him steadily. "What did not survive for 11 days was the certainty that you would, and I found I was unwilling to leave while that uncertainty remained." He didn't know what to say to that. He was a soldier. He was accustomed to situations where the right response was a specific action, and to emotional territory where the right response was less clear. He generally responded by being honest. "I wasn't trying to be a symbol," he said. I heard a sound. I knew where your quarters were. He stopped. "I could not." "I know," she said. And the way she said it, quiet, unhurried, like she was confirming something she'd already understood, told him that she did know. That she'd understood it the moment she saw him in that corridor, maybe before. "You told me something," he said. "When you passed me in the promenade, you said I had the face of someone who carries other people's weight." "Yes." "How did you know that?" She considered the question, not as if it were complicated, as if she were deciding how much of an answer was right for the moment. "The Vorith have been watching other species for a very long time," she said finally. "We have learned to read certain things, not thoughts, not futures, but history. The history that a person carries in their body, in the way they hold themselves, in the particular quality of their attention when they are not performing anything." She tilted her head slightly. "You are someone who has always put yourself between things and other people. You have been doing it since you were very young." He thought about Saba, about the monsoon streets, about a small protective instinct that had never found an off switch. "Yeah," he said. She nodded, as if that confirmed something. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and you can tell me if it's not appropriate." "Ask." "When they came through the door, you weren't afraid." He held her gaze. "Not the way I've been in situations. I know what fear looks like. You weren't afraid like someone who's surprised. You were something else." She was quiet for a moment. "We knew the risk of this transit," she said. "The Cathari opposition to the summit framework was known. The possibility of an attempt." She paused. "I was not surprised by what happened. I had made a decision before we departed about what I would accept as the cost of what needed to be done. She met his eyes. I had made peace with the possibility. This is different from not being afraid. The fear was there, but it had been processed, put in its right place. And then I came through the door. Something changed in her expression. Not a smile exactly, more like the expression of someone who has encountered something they had not accounted for in their calculations. And then you came through the door, she said, which I had not planned for that particular variable. What did you think when I came in? She looked at him for a moment, and then she said something that he would carry with him for a very long time. I thought, he has come in here to die for me, and I thought, he does not know that. He does not think of it that way. He is simply here because he could not be anywhere else. The room was very quiet. I am Salindra Vasvorath, she said. I have been the queen mother of my people for 40 of your years. I have attended councils of species that remember the birth of your civilization as a recent event. I have sat at tables where the decisions made would shape the trajectory of millions of lives. She paused. I have never in 40 years seen anything like what you did in that corridor. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. My people have a concept, she said. The Shenvrath, the threshold keeper, it exists in our oldest stories. The one who stands at the edge and refuses to yield. We have never applied it to someone outside the Vorath. She looked at him directly. We have now. My council made this decision in the first day after the attack before we knew if you would survive. I heard about that, he said carefully. What you perhaps have not been told, she said, is what it means in its full sense. She looked at him, and there was something in those amber eyes that was, he struggled for the word later when he tried to describe it to Fenris, solemn. Not sad, solemn. The Shenvrath in our tradition is not only an honor, it is also a relationship, a bond of obligation, not servitude. Not ownership, reciprocal, she paused. When someone stands at the threshold for you, you stand at the threshold for them. This is the oldest law of my people. He was quiet. I am telling you this, she said, not as a political statement, not as diplomacy. I am telling you this because you have a right to know what has been said about you among my people and what it means, and what, if you choose to understand it, it could mean going forward. I'm a corporal in the United Earth Forces, he said, not as deflection, as honesty. I'm from Karachi, I couldn't sleep. I heard a sound in a corridor. I know, she said, that is exactly why. She left after about an hour. He lay there after she was gone and thought about the conversation for a long time. He thought about what she'd said, about the threshold, about obligation, about standing at the edge. He thought about Saba and the way he'd always stood between her and the things that wanted to hurt her, without ever thinking of it as a choice, because it wasn't a choice. It was just what you did when you loved someone and they needed you. He thought about the way the Queen Mother had sat beside him when he was on his knee in that room, her hand on his shoulder, so that he wasn't alone. He thought about the 2 stacks of books by the bedside. And then the door opened, and someone else came in.